I'd like to talk about today are a couple of themes of what we see happening in India, what we see happening globally in the higher education trends, and then I'd like to briefly just touch on what's going on at Laureate. What is Laureate? What's Laureate Education? But before that, the organizer asked if I could just give a few words about my background. And I think to do so, I'd like to actually go back a few generations to my grandfather. My grandfather was born and raised in a very small village in Gujarat. He decided he wanted to make something of his life, and so he moved to the big city of Ahmedabad. This is now over 100 years ago. And when he went there, he had no education. He didn't have any connections. He had no money. He had no family ties. But he had a vision. He had a belief that if he can educate himself, he can get a good job, he can support a family, and he can go on and really make something for himself and for his extended family. And that's what happened. So my grandfather, my father's father, he put himself through school. He worked at an old cotton mill in Gujarat at this time. And in the mornings he would go to school, in the afternoons he would study in the cotton mill, and in the evenings he'd actually sleep in a little cot that was just below the cotton mill. And so for years, that was his routine. But through that process, he was able to get his university education, and then he got a master's degree in English, and then a master's degree in Sanskrit. And he really reinforced this value on education throughout all of his children. So he then had six brothers and sisters, six sons and daughters, of which one of them was my father. And the focus that he reinforced was education first. Education first, education first. And that value is what prompted my grandfather to encourage my father to go to the US. So 50 years ago this year, my grandfather sent my father to the US, and my father then got his master's degree in engineering, got married my mom, and then I was born. And then I grew up in the United States and went on to have a focus on education as well. I share that story because that desire to leverage education, to use education to make a difference, is something that's a universal aspiration. Definitely here in India, definitely in the States, all over the world, that sense that education does matter. It mattered definitely in the old economy, but it certainly matters, as Mr. Vinod Dham mentioned, in the new economy, in the knowledge economy, where that ability to analyze and understand and seize opportunities and do projects and execute is so critical to the future economy that we're now evolving into. And so that aspiration that my grandfather had and that my father reinforced is something that I wanted to share today as a little bit of my heritage, a little bit of my background. On a personal front, as I mentioned, I grew up in the US. I've been in education, running different education institutions now for 20 years. I've been at Laureate for 8 years, and I'll share a little bit more about what Laureate is in a few minutes. Let me jump right in and talk a little bit first about India, and then I'll share a little bit about global trends as I see them, and a little bit about Laureate. First, in India today, there's a lot going on a number of fronts that are going to impact the future of education here as I see it. As we all know, the population is continuing to grow. We'll surpass China. The population under 25 is continuing to grow dramatically at 620 million. GDP continuing to grow. Inflation, et cetera, all of those macroeconomics are moving in a healthy, stable direction. But the favorable dynamics on the bottom is something I'd like to highlight. What we're seeing is with this rising middle class, there's an explosion of higher education demand, and particularly in what we call gross enrollment rates. Gross enrollment rates is the number of people in the traditional age between 18 and 24 years old that should be going to university that are going. And what you see is that in just a little over a decade, the GER of India has gone from 10% of people between those ages, 18 to 24, going to college or university, jumping to 21%. And that number continues to rise. More and more people want to go to college in the traditional age group. It's just more than doubled as a percentage in just over a decade. In addition, colleges and universities that are being provided by the government cannot meet the demand. So there's this huge demand on the one side, but the public institutions, either at the center or at the state, can't meet the demand. So what's happening is that private institutions are increasingly becoming important Look at this explosion from 33% of all private higher education enrollment now jumping to 59%. More and more private institutions are coming into the foray. The good news is that there's opportunities. The challenge is that there's a mix of quality. And I think for those of us that are following the news, we see that there's a real mixed bag here. There's some institutions that are not particularly focused on good outcomes, on good employability, on good skills, and they're causing challenges. But by and large, there's a growing demand, and there's an opportunity for us to serve that demand. Now, the macroeconomics also favor all of this, right? So when you look at what's happening from a GDP perspective, as we're all seeing in the last 12 to 18 months, the gross domestic product growth rate, the GDP growth of India is now surpassing China. Just in this morning's CNN, it was reporting that this year's China GDP is going to be at the lowest since 2009, and it possibly could be even lower. So China is now slowing, India is on the rise, and that's coming across here, even ahead of Brazil and some of these other markets. This last month, India became the #1 country for foreign direct recipients, right, at $31 billion. And as I mentioned, the gross enrollment ratio continues to move in a positive direction. India is at 21% right now, China's at 26%, and Brazil is at 36%, which means that there's a lot of upside opportunity as more and more people want to go into higher education. What all this means with the drive of more and more people in the middle and upper class, the growing the younger age population, is that graph at the bottom right, which for me is very exciting. What you see is that in 2002 in India, there were about 10 million people in higher education in India. 2013, this is the last year that we have hard data, that number stands at 29 million. The projection, and some people believe this is conservative, is that the number of people that are going to be in higher education, in college or university, is going to be at 42 million people. That means by the end of this decade, in just 5 years, India will be the largest higher education market in the world. India will be the largest higher education market in the world, yeah? And that's just higher education. As you all know, that means that there's more secondary, that there's more primary, and so there's this incredible explosion that's being driven by the demographic trends of more young people coming in, plus the socioeconomic rise, right? The rising middle class. So all of these trends are, just from an organic standpoint, pointing towards more demand, significantly more demand for private higher education. What does this all mean when we try to put it to numbers? Now, forgive me for those of you in the back, I'll try to read this out loud. What we tried to do here is we tried to break the Indian education market into 3 broad segments. The core, which is the traditional education that you get in classrooms, primarily, right? Because we're moving towards the online world, but primarily still it's in the traditional, industrial revolution-like, factory-like classrooms, which is a total of $54 billion market today, is our estimate. You've got these parallel markets, which include various preschools, vocational training, K-12 tutoring or tuition, right? And test prep, which is a big business in India. Those are at about $18 billion. This is 2014 estimates. And then there's a sector we call Ancillary Services, which are various services that institutions or companies provide to K-12 schools or to higher education. Think of that as business to business, B2B part of education. So if you see the private spend in 2014, you'll see the 54 plus the 18 plus the 5. You'll see that the market is a pretty decent size just in private spending. So we're not talking about the government spending. We're talking about individuals or individual entities spending, investing in education to fuel the support for education. But what most excites me on this page is the column to the furthest right. Look at the compounded annual growth rates. 11 to 13% growth every year on average for the next 5 years for the core sector. 16 to 18% in the parallel education industry in India, and then 14 to 15% for all of these ancillary services. Now this, I will argue, doesn't even include the online and technology sectors. This is just projections of historical trends over the last 5 years, looking at basically what the demand is, and not counting the disruption that's currently happening and that Harman and Vinod just talked about. So just organically, if you're in the audience and you're in the test prep space, if you're in the higher ed space, if you're in distance ed, if you're providing services to education, you're in a great space, my friends. You're in a great space because this is an opportunity here. But as they say, watch out. We've got an opportunity to not only see that these trends are coming, but there's all these kinds of disruptive forces that are happening in parallel. So let's talk a little bit about what those are. At the same time that India is becoming this great market for education across multiple different segments, there are these dramatic disruptive forces that are taking place. And there's so many ways to frame this and segment this, but let's take a stab at talking about them from what the student is seeing. Personalized learning. This concept that the individual is getting learning that's relevant to their needs is a concept that people in pedagogy have been talking about for decades. But now with technology, it's actually possible to do this. And there's about a half a dozen education companies that have started in the last 3 to 5 years that have started to get some scale in this particular space. This is something very, very exciting for us from a laureate standpoint, and I'll talk about that more in a minute, because this means that we can start delivering education where we can do an assessment of the student's capability in a particular subject or skill at the beginning. We can tailor particular types of education to that student based on their profile. We can do assessments or tests along the way, formative and summative assessments, and then we can get them a credential that ties to their learning, right? That's personalized education. So the concept that technology can now deliver that in a mass customized way is something that's an incredibly exciting venture. I have a friend whose daughter is autistic, and this handicap has made it very difficult for them to go through the traditional education system. And the way that they have found a blended learning format where they use a significant amount of technology but then get the face-to-face support, as Harman was saying, it's that combination of face-to-face and technology that's just making a tremendous difference. And in just the 2 years that they've introduced this to her, her abilities to comprehend, to develop, are just at an order of magnitude from what she had all of these years prior. Personalized education isn't just for those with special needs. All across the planet there is this opportunity, but we have an opportunity to figure out how to make that work, right? This may sound futuristic in India right now, but I agree 100% with Vinod that this is happening, and this is not 20, 30, 40 years from now. This will happen in this decade, and there will be companies and institutions and pilots and tests, and we want to be part of that as well, that are starting to figure out how to do personalized learning at the K-12 space, at the higher ed space, in the working adult space. This is something very exciting. A second area that's very exciting is this whole area of gamification. This notion that you can make education fun. There's people in Hollywood that sometimes call it edutainment, education and entertainment combined. And it's this convergence of media, technology, and education coming together. So we're starting to see in Europe, in places like Amsterdam and Paris, certainly in California, in Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, we're starting to see a little bit of a cluster being created there of companies and institutions that are trying to get a hold of this disruption that's making education fun. Because let's face it, I taught for a few years, so I think we can all appreciate this as either teachers or as students. A lot of times school is just boring. I've got a 12-year-old, and he has an iPhone. And that device is 10 times more entertaining than anything his social studies teacher, his maths teacher, his English teacher could possibly ever do. So what do the teachers do? They find a way to make the education more fun. They use gamification in there. So this opportunity to engage learners, to help them develop and retain content and to internalize skills, to practice and apply this activity is really an important educational trend. And again, technology provides an incredible enabler to do that. So this is something really exciting. It's still in early stages in many of the developing countries. I'm seeing much more of that develop in more developed contexts. I know that the Cambridge University Press is doing some interesting things in this space because we're partners with them as well. But this is something that I believe is an important trend that will cut across K-12 plus higher education. And then finally, and Harman mentioned this as well, content collaborations. Institutions in education thinking strategically about the content, right? Thinking strategically about where do I source the content, Do I get the content developed in India? Do I get the content developed in another developing country? Do I get the content developed in a developed context? What portion of content do I want? How does it relate to education? How does it become interesting? How do I balance the cost side of it with the educational value side of it? How do I make it relevant for employers? There's a lot more demands on academic leaders to start thinking about content strategically, not just what the content was that I taught last year or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, not just doing an incremental fresh, but every single semester thinking about a disruption in how they deliver content, right? It's creating a culture of disruption in the academic leadership so that content becomes one of the enablers to really leapfrog and bring in new types of learning into the classroom. Again, for both K-12, test prep, as well as higher ed. So these are just 3 high-level trends. I know in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip through specifics on this, but these are 3 trends that we see occurring in various spaces, various flavors, and we just wanted to invite us to all consider these as we're at an EdTech conference, and one of the ideas is what are some of the big trends and how do we see these things evolving as we go. I'll just briefly mention that the big buzzword these days is unbundling of education, right? It's this concept that we're debundling or unbundling, that education for let's call it a university student might have been a 3-year or a 4-year experience, or for a master's a 1 or 2 year, and it's mostly about seat time. How much time is your butt in a seat, and then you finish the course, and as long as you kind of do okay and you pass your exams, you get through. It doesn't matter what you actually retained. It doesn't matter what the content is or the learning is. It's all about seat time. The transition now is more about competency. What did you actually learn? And can you actually apply it? And so this transition from a traditional notion where you have the whole education bundled in a physical building that costs, as Harman said, a ton of money, versus uncoupling it, fragmenting it, disrupting it into these different models is really this trend that's catching on. And so we have several institutions that are starting to take certain courses, and I'll show you an example of one right now, where they're taking a particular course and saying, you know what, we don't want to deliver this the same way. We think there's an opportunity to take a course from another part of the world and have a teacher from another country using technology actually deliver that content. It'll be richer, it'll be dynamic, and it'll be a different experience. So we're piloting and testing this type of thing in India. We're exploring this type of thing in Malaysia and Thailand as well. So these are just some examples of how you can disrupt this. And this can include the content piece, the way the lectures are organized, and of course, how do you use infrastructure, right? It's thinking about where is the learning coming from, as opposed to it just coming from a traditional teacher learning approach. As we all discussed, the disruption of technology is huge. We're seeing this in multiple formats. Virtual reality, very, very early stage, but it's really something that's quite thought-provoking, and there's some pilots that I've seen going on in India that are quite exciting in this area. Here's the pilot I just wanted to briefly mention. This is a program offered at Laureate, and we've just started introducing this in India, called One Campus. It's a very simple concept. It's a concept where you can think of a portal where individual institutions, teachers, can upload particular course content. So if I'm particularly good in math in my university, or if I'm particularly good at teaching Sanskrit or teaching history or whatever, I can upload my syllabus, and I can upload the content and the teaching material, and in the flipped classroom or other video-based notions, you can actually upload some of the video-based media material as well. So you've got one place where different types of content is starting to get uploaded, and that then becomes a single repository for university-level teachers or college-level teachers to grab those types of materials. And then to be able to pick and say, you know what, I want to have this type of content delivered. Or if I'm a dean, I don't have a teacher for this subject. I'm just going to go ahead and have that be taught by a teacher someplace else and have an arrangement with that teacher. So the idea is creating a cadre of teachers and content all over the world so that institutional presidents, institutional vice chancellors, deans, heads of department can actually choose the content, the curriculum, and even the teacher that they want to create. So it's this concept of a virtual classroom organizer globally. So that's what this one campus concept is. It's something we think that will provide a rich catalog of content. Students will be able to register once into this portal and out based on the subject that that particular institution asks them to be a part of. So think of it again as a portal that enables content to be created. It can be uploaded. It's very dynamic. I mean, we think this is something that is going to be particularly exciting as we move forward. What I wanted to do is just wrap up by highlighting a couple of things about Laureate. Laureate is an institution that was founded about 15 years ago. We currently have over 1 million students. We have 80 institutions in total. We're in 29 countries. India is one of those. And we have a total of 80,000 employees. So in terms of global education organizations, we're roughly the size of Pearson, Pearson Education, or some of these other global education players. We're based in the United States. We offer a range of undergraduate, master's, and doctoral programs. We either partner with an existing institution or provide a higher degree of operational support. So as I showed in that one campus example, that's an example of where Laureate provides this technologies platform that can be off of a learning system such as WizIQ, which, by the way, we're customers of, or can be off of another system. And the idea is that we deliver content to students in these different areas. And that's one of a number of different types of programs that we offer. We offer systems, shared online classes like the One Campus, back office integration, a lot of best practices support. We do quite a bit of work in dual degrees where you can take a program from one country and offer it in another country, which is starting to become a little bit more common in many developing countries. So this is a little bit of what we do at Laureate. I think just to wrap up, I'll just share that on a personal note, I'm extremely excited by what I see happening at WizIQ and really education technology in India. Since the founding of the institution, so much has changed, and with the Flipkarts of the world and e-commerce evolving, what I just wanted to share is that having grown up in the US, one trend that I found that was very interesting was that as e-commerce started to take off, not too far afterwards, online education and many other disruptive education formats using technology came. And I think that's starting to happen here, and I see it and feel it and sense it in many places. The fantastic success that WizIQ is having, becoming not just a major India provider of online learning solutions, but starting to become a global provider, is I think just one example. And there's many other examples of this happening with the work that Impartis is doing in video capture, with the work that's happening in all kinds of content plays, online enablers. There's a really exciting time to be in the education technology space in India. The domestic market is growing. There's a lot of disruption and innovation, but there's also opportunities outside of India for this type of innovation, this combination of technical skills, this passion and commitment for education, like I shared with my grandfather and my father and with many of your families, but also the economic need and the rising demand for the middle class. So I feel like this is a great time to have a conference like this, so congratulations for the conference, congratulations on all the success here, and I look forward to sharing the next couple of days with you here today. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, any questions that you would like to address to Mr. Sevak? Yes, so we have one, sir. Can we have a microphone? Okay, we already have one gentleman waiting here. We'll give you a microphone right after that. Yes, sir. Please identify yourself before you pose your question.
I run a small online learn tourism company. We teach tourism and collaborate on the content and all. So just major challenges entrepreneur gets, that is the monetizing that content or monetizing the course, whatever we have, and what should be the right platform to monetize your content. That is one of the challenge an entrepreneur like us get. So what is your take on that?
Great. So the question, just to make sure I got it and everyone got it, was you're an entrepreneur who has launched an online tourism platform.
Yes, tourism education company, Learn Tourism.
Learn Tourism. And the question is, how do you monetize this? How do you get some financial returns from this kind of investment? It's a great question. It's a classic startup question. And there's some great folks here in the room, including venture capitalists and investors that'll have, I'm sure, their point of view. For me, the question comes down to the customer. And do you have a sense, and not specific to you, but in general at that point in the startup of an institution, is who is the customer and how much are they willing to pay? And so, you know, to I really like the notion of the minimum viable product approach, the MVP approach, where if you have a product and you're an education startup and trying to get out there, you come up with a very simple product. What's the minimum viable product I need in the market that meets the basic demand? Nothing too fancy, just the basic product that's out there. And then let me go out there and try to test different pricing schemes. So for me, it's about the product and the price, trying to get that mix right. And so key is to fail fast. So testing a product, at a certain price, did that work, no, let me move on to a different format. The other concept of monetizing is figuring out what is the price point for scale. And in this context, a big part of it is sizing the market. And so, again, I'm sure you've thought about some of this stuff, but as I think about how do you size a tourism education business, right? So you think about the entire education landscape in India, you think about who's online, you think about the segment that's interested, and then you try to size it and look at the growth rate. I think a big part of it is just seeing what are the underlying demands. One of the big challenges I think we all have is traditional market research often doesn't work. The classic way big companies do market research to monetize a particular product is you go out and do focus groups, you go out and do some survey research, you go out and test it, you do maybe a pricing study or two, and then you can go out and launch a product at a certain price, and whoop, there you have your shampoo, or there you have your new toothbrush. That type of approach often doesn't work in a startup environment where we're trying to actually go with where new emerging trends are. So to summarize my comments, I think number one, it's this concept of minimum viable product, finding the product that serves the minimum need, not getting too complicated or too sophisticated, being simple with the product design, and then going out and pricing that and seeing what the pricing is that actually hits the market. If there are other analogies in other markets, that would be a reference. But certainly I would say simple product, price it at a level that you think can scale, and then through that experimentation, learn from there and grow. And then as I mentioned, sizing the market and figure out what the right segments are as you go. I'd have to get more into the details of the particular
We are
product.
already through that, means that stage we have passed.
Yeah, so that's good, that's good. And then the question is, if you're thinking that you're not monetizing enough, meaning your turnover, your revenue is not enough, maybe the question is, is the product the right fit with that segment? Do you need to expand the scope of the product to other segments? Maybe from tourism education, you move into something related, hospitality education, hospital, healthcare education, etc. So there might be just a segmentation thing. Maybe the market sizing could be another possibility. But happy to talk offline about that. Good.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm from the institute that prepares students for the SAT.
For the SAT?
Yeah.
So, just saying that gives me shivers, and it reminds me of 25 years ago when I took my SAT. So.
Right. So I just want to know that how you guys evaluate the content that is uploaded on your one campus.
Oh, how do we evaluate the content that is
I mean, there? You want to show the best content to the students.
Yeah, that's a great question.
So how you evaluate the content on that?
So we have content curators, just like a Khan Academy would, or just like any of the other education open systems do, where we have individuals that get the content proposals from the teachers and the deans, take a look at what they're offering, curate it, meaning to keep it into a simple format that can be then redeployed for other countries or for other regulatory bodies. So we have curators. There's 3 different kinds of people that are involved in curating content. There are instructional designers that design a course. There's a subject matter expert. And then there are pedagogy experts that focus on assessments and testing. Because we want to ensure that when a product is delivered to a particular institution, that product can meet those. So there's a lot of customization that goes into it. It's not just a simple, take it off the course. It's not like a Khan Academy that course is the same as everyone everywhere in the world. We customize it because each country has different regulatory or cultural aspects. But we use these 3 individuals, an instructional designer, subject matter experts, and then these pedagogical folks. Manually, yeah. So the system that's so the customer, the student feels it all electronically, but the actual preparation of the content for a particular institution is customized. Yeah, good. Yeah.
So we have time for just one last question, and Mr. Sevak is going to be here with us during the tea coffee break, and you can take your questions offline. But the last one, yes, sir. There he is.
So, Amit,
Okay, great.
I am Sanjeev Chaudhary from Koo Sports. We are promoting physical education in school. How technology is distracting our younger generation, and how we can, face this challenge.
How is technology restricting?
Distracting.
Oh, distracting.
Yeah, because kids are very much into digital format, and they hardly get a time to reach out to the field, and they don't have access to a better content. Even in schools, all the physical teachers, they are simply a discipline in charge. They are not teaching a structured physical education, age progressive, game specific. Everybody is not required to be a, Bill Gates, but everybody is required to be fit.
Yeah.
So this is how you address this. Thank you.
It's a great question. So the question for everybody is, how do we prevent technology from distracting us from delivering still a structured education that hits the basics? In the U.S., let me give you the example of how families and school districts are trying to address this. Number one, the development of a technology policy that applies where an institution says, okay, for my particular institution, what are the rules? Can I use phones in the classroom? Can I use iPads or other tablets? Can I bring in laptops? So in the school that my kids go to, they can't have any of that stuff in the classroom. They can only use it afterwards, unless it's specifically for a pedagogical purpose. So a technology policy that the parents are required to sign is one step in that direction of providing some, let's call it guidelines or boundaries on the effective use of technology, number one. Number two, my experience with what education institutions can do, and this is something that education institutions sometimes find is a little awkward. I actually hire people from outside of education for the IT function. So, I handle Laureate's operations for South and Southeast Asia. We've got about a dozen different institutions, and the IT head is typically either the head or their team are typically folks that are from other industries, because there's a lot of fresh ideas that we need on trying to figure out and structure what are the restrictions we can do from a pedagogical standpoint in there. And then they then partner with the academics to figure out what the delivery mechanism is. So a good partnership between the technology leaders and the academic leaders. I'm answering your question from the institutional perspective. Maybe you're looking at it from a parental perspective. The last thing I'll just mention is from the US standpoint, an important point. In the US, in the K-12, there's something called the Common Core that's being established, which is setting standard guidelines for all K-12 students. That means if you're a second grader in an American school, whether you're in California or Wyoming or Massachusetts, you have a standard curriculum that you're delivering, right? What they're doing is they're putting that in a blended format. And so they're looking for ways where they can introduce slowly standards, so you get the structure and the basics, but doing it in a way that uses technology so that there's video, so that there's gamification, so there's some of these things to make the content interesting. It's a delicate balance. I don't know if anyone's ever figured it out. I haven't seen any magic pill that you can take that suddenly says, okay, you can give the kids structured learning and you can give them the digital value. But the reality is, and I think Vinod had mentioned it perfectly, is our generation that's coming up, these 2, 3, 4-year-olds, and certainly the ones before them, the Gen Y and the Gen Z, the Generation Y and the Generation Z, are digital natives. I mean, they're expecting their education that way. So the question I might ask you is that if we force a world in which they have to be structured in the old way, the way we did it, they may not be, number one, they'll reject it, but number two, they won't be able to be adapting and applying their skills for the world economy where technology is going to become a day-to-day part of it. So I don't have a magic solution here. Let me think about it too. But I would say technology policies, good people that are partnering between academics and technology, and then looking for these kinds of standards that start to get created that slowly bring in technology in an effective way into the learning are just some of the thoughts there.